The proceeding will start shortly.
Order. This is a meeting of the Northern Ireland Affairs Select Committee, and I'm delighted today to be joined by three witnesses to help us explore the implications of the publication of the interim report into Operation Kenova. Clearly an important, sensitive issue that we want to explore with care, and I'm delighted today that we have a panel that can help us do just that. I'm joined by Sir Iain Livingstone, who, as we know, is the officer in overall command of Operation Kenova. With him is John Boutcher, now Chief Constable of the Police Service of Northern Ireland, who was the former officer in overall command of Operation Kenova, and Judith Thompson, member of the Victims Focus Group, who of course herself was the first was the Commissioner for Victims and Survivors for Northern Ireland from 2015 to 2020. I'm delighted that this distinguished panel has joined us, and we'll move straight on to the first question, and I'm going to ask Kelly Tolhurst to come in. Kelly.
Thank you, Chairman. Welcome everyone, and it's great to have you here for the session. My first question would go to Mr. Boutcher. Can you explain what you believe to be the main achievements of Operation Kenova?
Yeah, of course, and thank you, Chair and Committee, for inviting us today to talk about the report and the work of Kenova, because it helps with your question, actually. I think Kenova has achieved, on the back of a lot of good work in the past in legacy, probably a success with regards to each of the families that we have assisted. Finally, and this is their words, and we're collecting a lot of testimonies from them now, without exception, saying finally they feel that they've been listened to. Their stories have been acknowledged, their loss has been acknowledged, but most importantly, that they've been told information they've never been told before about how their loved one died, why their loved one died, the circumstances of that death, what happened at the end for some of those individuals, which has provided a level of comfort that they never had before. And some of them had given up hope of ever receiving what we would expect, I think, routinely in Great Britain, that sort of honesty, that level of disclosure with regards to the loss of their loved ones. So that confidence, that trust, the legitimacy almost that we have managed to achieve with those families, many of whom had lost all confidence and trust in the authorities, in the executive, in policing, we've recovered that position. And I know Sir Iain has been inundated with emails and testimonies, as have I, around the individual meetings, particularly that people have now had and continue to receive with that wealth of information. But also when the report was published on the 8th of March, and I remember when I started this work, I phoned a solicitor who represents a number of suspects that we would want to interview, and he said, and I quote, "You've got no chance, son, you'll be gone in 6 months, you'll never get anywhere." And that's how the families felt. And I think we've managed to reset the bar there. But before I close on the remarks to that question, and I did say on the back of others, when we started this work, we spoke to all those who've done incredible work in the past that are reflected in the report. People like Lord John Stevens, the Corey investigative team. Judge Corey was too poorly to speak to us when I took on the case, now sadly passed away, but Rennie Pomerantz, and she makes comments in the report. She is a judge now in Canada about Judge Corey's work. Judge Smithick, again, and Mary Laverty, his senior counsel, all provided us with counsel around this. Sir Desmond de Silva also gave me some really helpful advice and stewardship. And of course the historical inquiries team that Sir Hugh Ord established and John Cox, who led that, and Sir Hugh himself, all helped shape Kenova. And hopefully Kenova is helping to shape the ICRIR, which is the commission that obviously begins their work shortly to help victims as well.
Thank you. Iain, obviously there's more work to be, what we aren't, we obviously had the interim report. Can you give us a sort of overview of the tasks and the time frame for when the full investigation will be completed and for the conclusion of the work that you've been doing?
Well, thank you for that. We said we would publish a final report, and we're looking to do that by the end of the year. That will be based on specific information to individual families. So John's report was very, I suppose, high-end or drew out the themes, where what we want to do now, and we are doing, meeting individual families, giving them specific details as to what happened to their loved one, and then we will close the Kenova work with a report that I am aiming to conclude by the end of this calendar year. Now, within that report, I also felt it was important to reflect exactly what work Kenova has done over the last number of years, because it was initiated with the work regarding the agent steak knife, but in the course of the last 5 to 6 years, it's also picked up a number of other really, really important areas of responsibility, often pieces of work that fell into the responsibility of the PSNI, but for grounds of transparency, visible independence, various chiefs have then asked Kenova to pick up these pieces of work. So one really important piece of work is Operation Turma. That was the murder of 3 police officers at Kinnigo Embankment in 1982. That work actually grew from a piece of work that Police Scotland had done under my leadership in 2014-15. And that is a live criminal investigation. Kenova had made strides, that hadn't been able to have been made in the last 40 years, and currently that is with the DPP in Northern Ireland for consideration. There was also the murder of Jean Smith-Campbell in 1972 in West Belfast. That's Operation Mizzenmast, and again, Kenova took that piece of work on. And then in 2019, there was a judgment that Lord Justice Declan Morgan gave in the Barnard case that called for a review of the so-called Glenanne series, which relates to allegations of collusion with loyalist paramilitaries in South Armagh and beyond. And again, for reasons of independence, Kenova took that piece of work on. So that's, in a way, the stable of Kenova work is the steak knife work it initiated with, the murder of the 3 police officers in Turma, Mizzenmast, the murder of Jean Smith-Campbell, which again we have concluded and will report on, and then this review work on the Glenanne series.
On Denton, yeah. That's
Operation Denton, sir, absolutely. So those 4 pieces of work all need to be brought to a head and reported on, and that's a challenge for me, is to recognise the value and extraordinary progress that Kenova's made, but also bring it to an end and allow the new arrangements to bed in through the Commission. So all of that work needs to be done, I would say in the next 6 to 9 months, and then again we'll report publicly. But the reason that those other areas were given to Kenova was because there was an infrastructure there, because they had gained the trust and confidence of communities that had been estranged from agents of the state, such as myself and the authorities, if you like. And that level of confidence, as colleagues in this committee will know better than I, in Northern Ireland is so valuable. So we've built on that in progressing those other matters, and in all 4 areas we will be looking to report, I hope, within the next 9 months.
Right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bob, did you want to come in very briefly?
Good morning. Nice to see you. Bob Stewart's my name. Thank you so much for coming. My question really is actually to you, Judith, really, if you don't mind me calling you Judith. This is an incredible, huge amount of work you guys have been involved in. I can't, the scope is huge. And many of the people, the victims and the families, are grateful. But Judith, can I ask you, is there a section of the families or the victims that actually categorically refuse to have anything to do with this or think it's a total waste of time?
So the Victims Focus Group, which I'm part of, has conducted a survey of families, the Kenova families, and at an early stage. We've had meetings with individuals. I had meetings with groups of individuals in my former role as Commissioner, and we've had an overview in an ongoing way. And whilst I understand your question, and I think in the most general sense there probably are people who feel like that, I have not come across it in relation to this investigation. And I think there are reasons for that. I think the level of engagement that the Kenova team have had from the top down, so that started with John Boutcher and has been followed through by Sir Iain, where individual families met the person leading the investigation and genuinely understood that a rigorous attempt was being made to properly investigate and to retrieve information that might not have been previously retrieved. And that has been seen as something which offers in itself a recognition, a due process, a proper experience of a rigorous and transparent investigation. I think that in itself actually has been incredibly well received pretty universally by the people involved in this.
I have to say the reports I've read in my life, which is quite long now, this is probably the most profound, detailed and thorough job done by the people at the top and all the way through. I congratulate you. It wasn't a challenge really, it was just a question and you've answered it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, gentlemen, and Ms. Thompson. It's lovely to see you, and thank you. I think I'd like to put in record our thanks for all that you have done and all that you continue to do, and it's much appreciated. It's not an easy task, by the way, and we appreciate the difficulties that you have. The independent steering group and the victims focus group was really necessary to have them in place. Maybe, John, if you don't mind, you could give us your thoughts on why it was really important and what it hopes to achieve, please.
The independent groups, so they were really critical at the start. I think, you know, to a certain extent, and I'll characterise this with a couple of early meetings I had with families, where one family who I won't name because of reasons of their privacy, but the son of a victim said, well, what's different with you? Another English accent, we've heard it all before, and he described a particular incident where some detectives had been to see him and his mother, who was widowed through this murder, and they said that they back in touch with the family. The individual concerned, the son of this victim, saw these detectives at Belfast City Airport about a year later and said, I suppose you're still going to come back to me on this case. And he said to me, you've been given a big responsibility here. My mum cannot take, this family cannot take being let down and lied to again. So please don't do that. And he sent me actually quite an email that I read to the team when we just set up within 3 or 4 months of being established. And the email was incredibly well crafted and fair, very much recognising the different sides of the troubles, the incredible job the security forces had done, but he felt the security forces had been unable to investigate his father's murder properly, which is, I think, a fair comment. But he outlined in very, very clear language that the families had had enough, and this couldn't fail. So, to reassure him that this wasn't a single approach, there's no monopoly on good ideas with me or any of the team, and knowing that we had to do something different, and speaking to those various people that I mentioned in answering the first question, I decided to set up initially an independent steering group. And the independent steering group, the purpose for that group, and all of the terms of reference are on the Kenova website, was to effectively create a star chamber of investigators who would make sure that we weren't missing anything, would make sure we weren't accepting something that we shouldn't accept because, you know, I'm a police officer now over 40 years in policing. We all become institutionalised. We all have unconscious biases. So I set up this independent steering group that is represented from people from North America, you know, John Miller, who actually tracked down bin Laden in Afghanistan and did an interview before the 9/11 attacks, a guy, Mike Downing, who was the chief of Los Angeles Police, Cathy O'Toole, who was the ex-chief of Boston and has a very rich understanding of Northern Ireland because she was the advisor, the overseas advisor and policing advisor on the Patent Commission. Sir Iain Livingstone, to give some UK perspective, and we also had the ex-head of the United Nations investigations. And that group would hold my hand to the flame of accountability to make sure that we'd done everything properly. And it'd be a bit like this committee. I would sit on one side, they would all sit the other side, and we'd have a meeting for 2.5 or 3 days every 3 or 4 months, and they would test what I was doing. And that provided me with the reassurance we were doing everything we could, but also it provided families with a layer of accountability that showed this just wasn't me or the team doing the work. And the victim focus group, I have to say, I was very aware early on speaking to families that families in Northern Ireland in troubles-related cases from all different profiles are not treated as victims are treated in mainstream GB. They're not. There is a distance, there is a remoteness. They don't get the level of interaction and responsiveness and information provision that we would give people in offences today. Of course, the world's moved on, but also there's a real barrier, psychological barrier in dealing with troubles-related families. I don't quite understand why, but it exists. So we then brought in this victim focus group, which is a group which Judith was then the Victims and Survivors Commissioner in Northern Ireland, where I sought a group of people, none of whom I knew, who were victim experts, again to hold us accountable as to how we were treating victims. And that included even Lev Alton, who works in Europe and wrote the Victims Charter, the European Victims Charter, as to how victims should be treated. So all of what we did, and we also built in, Jim, and it's an extension to your question, a number of independent reviews. So we were reviewed by Alison Kilpatrick, who's now the Chief Commissioner of Human Rights in Northern Ireland, who was recommended to me by council in London as the subject matter expert. Indeed, it was the reviewer of counter-terrorism legislation, Jonathan Hall, who advised me to use Alison for a review to look at our Article 2 compliance around Kenova. So all of these reviews, we also had National Police Chiefs Council Homicide Working Group look at what we were doing. They were all there to provide layers of reassurance and reassurance and reassurance that we were doing this as well as it could be done. And also, if I'm candid, because it's a difficult operating environment, you are always going to get criticised in Northern Ireland from one side or another. It provided us with a layer of protection against any criticisms because we had so much independent scrutiny around the investigation.
I suppose, Mr. Chairman, where I'm coming from, thank you for that, by the way. Okay, I'm conscious of. I'm conscious that there are some people who feel that justice has never happened.
Yeah.
For instance, those on the payroll, spies within the groups, whether they be within IRA or within loyalist groups. For instance, Mr. Columba McVeigh, murdered by the IRA.
Yeah.
His body never found, his family never has a justice. Yeah. Again, an example of where the system has clearly not given justice for the families. I think as well of a friend of mine, and I mean a friend of probably many within this chamber, is Raymond McCord. Yeah. His son murdered, not because of any terror, but scoring, settling a score against him, a young fellow who had the courage to stand up against loyalist terrorist groups, and his father has sought justice all those years. I know I've tried to help him in a small way, Mr. Chairman, as an elected representative. That's just 2 examples. There's many, many more, where some of those who were in the payroll or on the payroll for within the police service, and were the people who were passing the information, but they were using their position in that to score against people and take out retribution against those who just happened to be stronger. There's many like that. There's many more cases. I'm not going to go over them all, Mr. Chairman. John, you'll know them, and Iain and Judith will know them as well. But I really feel quite aggrieved, Mr. Chairman, whenever I think when it comes to justice. At all those years, those 20, 30, 40 years of waiting for justice, there's never been any. And their mums and their dads and their families have passed away. So when it comes to justice, I just wonder to myself where that justice is and when it's going to come for them families. And that's a comment that I don't know if you want to reply to that, John, please.
The only thing I'd say, both of those families you've mentioned, through the work I've done, I've met and spent time with, and they're remarkable families. I don't make any comment on who were or were not agents at all. It's not my place to do that in this forum. What I would say is that the fragility, if you like, or the vulnerability of Kenova is that I always felt, and it's been described to me as that there's a hierarchy of victims in Northern Ireland. Some victims, because they are supported by very successful lobbying groups, will get inquiries, Bloody Sunday, other events where quite rightfully there's been an examination of the circumstances of what's happened. Kenova looked at a particular profile of victims in Northern Ireland. I meet many, many victims who aren't represented legally. They don't work with victims groups, but have approached me privately just to ask questions. And they deserve, as everybody deserves, an equitable opportunity to be engaged with, to have their stories heard, Indeed. And to get whatever information is available to help them understand what happened. And obviously, we're about to see the beginning of the commission, and I just hope that can succeed in helping those families. But your remarks are not lost on me around the families.
I know to be fair they're not, John, but I need to put on record those two have always been in my mind. Judith, a wee question, indeed referring to the victims' focus group. Your involvement in that has been significant, and we all appreciate that. But how do you feel that the victim focus group has been able to influence the course of any investigations? Has it been for the better? I suspect it has been, but I think sometimes when we look at things, we perhaps maybe by our very nature, Mr. Chairman, always see the negatives and perhaps don't see the positives. So if there are positives, I think it'd be important that maybe you could let us know what they are, please.
Can I start by just saying how much I recognise the comments you just made about people feeling let down? So that individuals, and most particularly this group of individuals, have experienced the loss, the trauma, the horrendous violence by which they lost members of their families, and then they experience stigma and sometimes victimisation as well within their own communities. So that is then compounded by a justice system which doesn't seem to respond in any way to the loss they've suffered. And I know there are many families for whom their meeting with the Kenova team was the first time they had sat in a room with a police officer, even though in some cases they had evidence or were the last person to see that person alive. So we are talking here about a group of people who, for a range of reasons, have been more isolated and let down even than the many, many people who've had that experience in Northern Ireland. So I think on the positive side, the first thing to note is that actually they have, I think for the first time, for most of them, had the real sense that somebody cared, that there was a genuine effort being made to find out the things they wanted to know, because wanting to know the truth is pretty universal. There are many people who really wanted to see prosecutions and weren't going to, but in this instance, for some people, the prospect of prosecution was an anxiety because they feared a repeat of all the victimisation and stigma they had suffered previously, that might accompany the revisiting of the case through a trial. So justice means different things to different people, but I think being treated seriously by the justice system, being given access to justice and seeing some level of procedural fairness is really important. And I want to quote one very impressive woman who I heard interviewed on the radio recently about this and who I have met a number of times, who just said, "It gave me my mother back." Instead of being depersonalised, just seen through the lens of the label informer or the violence that was inflicted upon her, her mother became an individual whose rights were respected, whose death was marked by the justice system and formally in this report, and who mattered.
I think I would feel that that's what, if you've had 10, 15, 20, maybe 30 odd years with never having any opportunity, I think it's absolutely vital that they're given respect, that they're given, they feel confidence in the system, which I don't think they have. Iain, can I ask you a quick question as well, and I'll finish with this, Mr. Chairman? Okay. The independent governance arrangements that were established by your predecessor, do you feel that they're sufficient, or do you feel that there could be some changes that should happen to improve that? I'm not being critical, by the way, I'm just asking the question.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jim. The governance has always been a key part of our collective thinking, if you like. John talked about the independent steering group, and I was involved in that from the outset, so really going back to 2016. So George Hamilton was the then chief in the PSNI at the time, and because of criticism over previous cases and whatnot and handling of investigations, George and I had a number of conversations. I said we'd had Operation Cleaner, which had related to the hay sheds in the 1980s. And this concept of an independent external police service or an independent external police investigator or senior investigator was something that I think we need to give credit to Sir George Hamilton for doing, because the responsibility for these matters never goes away from the Office of Chief Constable. Because although we are independent, ultimately it has to root back into the Chief Constable, because that's where the legal responsibility sits. So John's independence was really critical, and that independent steering group that John talked about, very distinguished individual, the Victims Focus Group that Judith led. Subsequently, a governance board that was established, again, to provide rigour that I later chaired after Sir John Chilcott, the late Sir John Chilcott, had chaired. These were really, really important to provide that structure. Now, the change of police leadership in Northern Ireland towards the end of last year was a major issue. And this was when various members of the community, various people, perhaps members of this committee, were saying, Northern Ireland needs good, ethical, experienced, professional police leadership, and John Boutcher's the man to do it. And if you're asking part of the Kenova legacy for me as a citizen now is that John Boutcher's the Chief Constable of the PSNI. But for John to do that, John was adamant that he hadn't finished the Kenova work that I summarised earlier. And he was adamant that despite those encouragements, he wasn't going to apply for the Chief's position unless he was convinced that the level of independence would be continued. And that's when he spoke to me. And I'd only recently retired from being the Chief Constable in Scotland for 6 years. And to be candid, it wasn't really in my short-term plan. I was going to take a gap, and just almost give yourself a little bit of space. But because of the importance of the work, I agreed to take it on. And genuinely, I've said this to my own family. I wouldn't have changed my own plans had it not been for the importance of Kenova. And because of my background as a chief in Scotland for 6 years, I've been challenged on operational independence. I've had to show separation from politics. I've had to show the fact that the police will operate independently according to the rule of law and according to justice and public safety. I think John had confidence to ask me to take that role, and only when he was satisfied that independence would continue and that our relationship, although we are professionally close, John would never ever interfere with my independence as the leader now of Kenova. So we recognised that was a challenge, but I think both of us were absolutely committed to maintaining that independence that John as the Chief Constable ultimately has responsibility, but myself as officer and overall command are fully empowered. And to be frank, I wouldn't have accepted the role on any other basis.
Yes, thank you for your answers, and also, Mr. Chairman, I wish you well for the future, all three of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. Robert Goodwill.
Thank you very much. I'd like to sort of follow up a little bit on that, because obviously we're all very pleased actually and relieved when you were appointed as Chief Constable, John. It was having got to know you very well through your Kenova work. And then so my immediate reaction, I remember, was, oh great, John's Chief Constable. And then, oh dear, he's not going to be in charge of Kenova anymore. So, you know, we're pleased that Sir Iain's moved into that role. I just want to ask you a little bit, because you're always very, very keen to stress how the independence of Operation Kenova is so important. Yep. And although you're now sort of gone from poacher to gamekeeper, you know, how will you ensure that that independence is maintained? And how will your relationship with Sir Iain be different maybe to your relationship with professional relationship with previous Chief Constable, given that you know, are you going to be able to get the balance right between sort of being a backseat driver but also feeding in what experience you need to feed in? I mean, how is that going to work?
So firstly, I just want to echo, because it is important this, what Iain has just said. When through difficult circumstances last year in Northern Ireland that befell the PSNI, lots of different issues arrived all at once for an organisation that is outstanding. I was approached to apply for that role. I made it very clear that I couldn't do that because of my commitment to Operation Kenova, and it was only when, and he was the only person I thought could do it because of his involvement in Kenova to that point, that I contacted Iain. And I did say, look, there's no pressure here, but if you can't do this, then I can't do that. I've got to stay with Kenova because of the commitment I've made to the families. But I think because of what I've learned on Kenova and the relationships that I have built, and it has been, every day has been a school day on Kenova. I have today to say this, every day is now a school day as the Chief Constable of PSNI, but I think I could see that it would help me in the role as Chief Constable because of what I've experienced in Operation Kenova, the relationships I've built with the security forces, the retired officers, the victims groups, the various community groups who, you know, had felt a lack of confidence and trust. All of that I thought would help with the role of Chief Constable. And I have to say, Iain and I had a very honest conversation, a very authentic conversation about the lines of separation if I was then successful as Chief Constable, for him to pick up the reins. And there was an interim position that I accepted initially. But a couple of things to note. Firstly, when I set up Kenova, I was pretty challenging to Sir George Hamilton around the independence of how it would be done. And I'll be honest, when I first got asked, I had no idea. I'll be frank, I had no idea. There wasn't, you know, a particular group of people I could move in. There was no existing structure to deal with this. So it was an incredibly sharp learning curve and listening to, you know, people's experiences to how to do this. I will say, the ex-head of covert policing, undercover policing. I have quite a rich background in dealing with very challenging investigations. So from that perspective, I was fine. But Northern Ireland is a very unique operating environment, and you need to have real emotional intelligence across the piece. The job of Chief Constable is so all-encompassing anyway. I haven't got time to interfere with Operation Kenova. I really haven't. If I did have any time to interfere with it, I would soon get a rebuttal from Sir Iain about his operational independence. So in a way, I think it's the best of both worlds, because of my understanding around the challenges of getting information, of getting reports out, of going through the protocol process that I wrote. There is basically a protocol, it's on the Kenova website, that sets how we will deliver our reports so they can be delivered in a way that families, stakeholders, society knows that they are legally sound and robust, the first report being the one that we released on the 8th of March. That's a time-consuming process. It's a challenging process legally. So I haven't.
You're saying it's baked in effect. And
yeah, exactly. Yeah, it is literally. It's an ideal term, baked in, but it's a challenging process. So I have a level of understanding and sympathy of what Sir Iain has to now manage, and the final report and the Denton report are huge pieces of work. Where I think there is added value is my understanding of the challenges that he is facing, and where I can help, I will. But the entire show, all of the Kenova suite of investigations, now sits entirely with operational independence with Sir Iain Livingstone.
Will it be help when asked for, or help when you feel it's needed?
Well, when asked for, certainly. I'm so busy, sometimes I'll ring Iain to check that everything's okay with Kenova, and I'll feel guilty that I've not spoken to him for a couple of weeks, because I know he's got an incredibly challenging diary, because it was previously my diary. So no, listen, the independence I'm very comfortable with. There is a formal process of reporting to the Chief Constable by the Officer in Overall Command quarterly. I get updates from Sir Iain about the progress. Obviously, we're in a unique position of transition into the Commission as well, and as Iain described very eloquently, the bringing to a closure of the Kenova investigations and reports for families. So I'm pretty up to speed on the challenges that he faces there. So nobody has raised an issue around the independence. I've been very clear about handing the baton to Sir Iain, and so far it's worked very, 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 very well.
You echo that, Sir Iain?
I would, Sir Robert. As I said, I wouldn't have taken the role on under any circumstances. I'd spent over 31 years as a police officer in Scotland, and latterly as a Chief Constable, where my operational independence was tested pretty regularly without rehearsing matters in Scotland. So it was never anything that I would compromise on. I think you're highly accountable, rightly, in public, to committees such as this, to the Northern Ireland Policing Board, to the community, to the public through the media. But your decision-making must be independent, and you must then take responsibility for that. But as John said, I would be a fool not to seek some advice or some guidance on a particular case or a particular set of circumstances. But we work very well together. But we, as John talked about, candid conversation. We speak to each other very directly if needed, and I think that is ultimately in the public interest.
Thank you. That's very reassuring. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Bob Stewart.
Ladies and gentlemen, what I want to concentrate is on the conclusions and recommendations being transferred into government policy. Are you satisfied, Sir Iain, that the conclusions and recommendations so far are being taken note of by government?
Again, thanks for the question. That is very pertinent. Only last week or maybe 2 weeks ago, I had a meeting with colleagues in Cabinet Office where the purpose of it was really just to, the interim report had been published in early March, was to just pause for breath, see where we were, and in a way allow the Cabinet Office to act on behalf of Whitehall as a whole and the government as a whole in terms of the approach to the recommendations. Now, not all the recommendations are necessarily directed towards HMG, but I think there's interest and locus in that regard. So the Cabinet Office have taken the lead role. I wrote to one of the senior officials there just actually at the end of last week, setting out where we were. And I know that the government at this time, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland and others, are looking at the issue regarding the need for an apology and that recognition. I think John rightly gave the analogy with the then Prime Minister Cameron's apology regarding Bloody Sunday, almost as a way of not drawing a line, but creating a foundation to go forward. So that's under consideration at the moment. There's the issues, rightly, that John has raised regarding the need for a review of the NCND policy. None of us here, we've spent our lives benefiting from it and utilising it and working within that sphere. But that doctrine, I think, could do with a consideration. It's evolved over time, like so many other issues. It has no basis there's no statutory basis. It's an operational practice. It has very sound reason behind it in many theatres and for many different agencies. But I think from the Kenova work has shown that it would benefit from a wider consideration, a more reflection, a common understanding of its meaning and its application. So I think there's a number of elements in the 10 recommendations that will be progressed. The other one about the declassification of certain reports and whatnot. So the short answer, and apologise if my answer there was too lengthy, the short answer is I've got a very active engagement with Cabinet Office on behalf of the government, and I think they are taking the recommendations very seriously.
Oh, sorry, that raised a quick question for me. To whom do you actually report? Do you report the Prime Minister, Cabinet Office, obviously, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, or the Home Secretary?
Well,
do you report to all of them?
I report to the Chief Constable of the
okay, fine.
Well,
I know who the Chief Constable reports to, so I think the question's answered. So you report to the Chief Constable, yet you're dealing with the Cabinet Office.
Yeah, because back to the question that was raised earlier, because of my operational independence, I need to operate in an independent manner. Yeah. But I have no authority, if you like, other than that's been granted by the Chief Constable. So, but in terms of the practice, the day-to-day independence, I take the lead on that. We've had that level of engagement with Cabinet Office, and obviously they will coordinate across the various departments, have interest, not only NIO, but obviously Home Office and others that you
I'm sorry, I've got quite a lot of detail in the questions that I've got to ask. I mean, I'm talking about conclusions 6 and 7 for a start. So, does government policy allow victims who want a prosecution to have a chance of securing one, and people that don't want a prosecution, can they not have a prosecution, as it were?
I think what Bob is referring to there is the crossover between the conclusions you made about the fact that some families want prosecution, others don't. There's that continuing wrongful stigmatisation of families where people who are killed were accused as agents. How does that cross over to the policy under the 2023 Act and the work of the new Commission is what Bob is getting at? What's the read across?
Yeah. Again, really interested in challenging issues. The first thing I would say was that prosecution decisions are not a matter for us as investigators, whether it's as an independent investigator or for the PSNI. That's a matter for the DPP in Northern Ireland, the PPSNI. And the point you make about, and Judith had alluded to earlier, about the feelings and the attitude of a victim and their family is a key factor in any prosecutorial decision that would be made, as well as matters of public interest. So in that prosecution decision, I think the sensitivity would be there again, as well as the normal tests of evidential standard and public interest.
But I think what Bob is getting at is, obviously we're in this transitional period to the work of Sir Declan Morgan and the Commission. How's that going to affect the ongoing work in Kenova?
Well, where prosecution decisions have been taken prior to the 1st of May, they will continue. Yeah. So that will be the case. Thereafter, Kenova, we will not report any other matters for prosecution decisions after the 1st of May. That will then be a matter for Sir Declan and his team, depending again on the number of cases that go forward. Now, there is no doubt that a number of the cases that we have dealt with as a team potentially could go into the work of the Commission. So, my part of my role, as well as bringing Kenova to an end, I think is to ensure, given we know the legislation had different views on it, etc. But that is the law of the land, yes. And therefore my role and responsibility is to taper off Kenova and as best we can support the new work of the Commission, the learning that we've had. Perhaps some of the key resources, i.e. some of the investigators who have gained the trust, and they're outstanding individuals who have been working on Kenova for a number of years. Not all of them, but a number of them may go into Commission staff. So the ethos of Kenova, the approach of Kenova, can be sustained with the work of the Commission, albeit their remit is clearly far greater and wider.
Or any follow-ups?
Well, to be honest, I got a bit more, but I'm trying to cut down so that we can get on.
Okay. Well,
to be honest, I'm going to skip the next question, I think, and go straight to my final one. Transitional arrangements I'm talking about here. Are they interfering? Surin, are they likely to interfere in your end-of-term work, as it were? Because transitional arrangements can really screw up what you're trying to do. So that's my question. I'm trying to telescope it down, and that's what I've done.
I hope they won't, and I expect they won't. I think that the NIO and the Secretary of State have been very supportive of allowing Kenova to finish our work.
Yeah.
So that is in the Denton work that I mentioned earlier, the role of the Loyalist paramilitaries. That is a significant piece of work. It's a review rather than an investigation, and a number of the families were very concerned that we were going to have to come to a hard stop at the end of April and not be able to finish this review work. There was always the intention that we would be allowed to do that, but I welcomed the transitional arrangements because it made it clear that the work that Kenova had in place could be finished. So the work that we need to finish is the Denton work. We will put a public report on the Glenanne series, and we will also then publish a final Kenova report that will cover all the 4 areas I described earlier, as well as an update on the recommendations and some other reflections on the work and the outcomes.
You've already said that you're going to sort of aim to finish by the end of this year, 2024. Have you got enough time?
It is incredibly demanding, and John and I had a discussion around...
John's giggling.
Yeah,
he doesn't think so.
I think John is smiling wryly.
He thinks I'm being over ambitious or perhaps naive, but I do want... I seriously want to maintain some momentum because, colleagues in this committee and others, we've all been involved in pieces of work that are challenging, and unless we try and give ourselves milestones to finish, matters can drift. And we've done all the work. The challenge now actually is articulating it and gathering it and then presenting it in a manner that this committee and the public can then understand and can assess. So we are very intense around that work. I'm saying the end of this calendar year. I suppose my backstop would be the end of the financial year and try and
really go on. But looking at Judith, do your constituency, do you think they would be satisfied by the end of this year? Do you think they think it could be done?
Of what the expectations are from victims and survivors, particularly in relation to the Denton report. It's incredibly important work for them, and to see the kind of report that they are hoping to see with the kind of informed approach that maybe they haven't had before.
That final report's going to be really
huge
crucial.
Piece of work and really significant.
Yeah. I'm sorry I've taken so long.
Oh, it's fine. And can I just say, look, we've all a lot of us in this room, me included, have had a lot of experience of criminal investigation and prosecution. You know, this is difficult stuff, and I think it's right that, you know, whilst we try and get on with it and give some hope to families, they want it to be done properly.
They do, bearing in mind their experience. And I think we're entitled, you know, to, you know, query each other about timescales, but also remember the, you know, the incredible seriousness of what we're dealing with here. And I don't think, you know, we should lose that at all. I'm going to bring Claire Hanna in now.
Thank you very much for being with us. I'm going to come on to disclosure, but I wanted to follow up on prosecutions. And in the interim report, you make commentary about the resourcing of the DPP, but you do give a solid analysis of the files that went forward. It says in the report, for my part, I believe they contain significant evidence implicating Steakknife and others in very serious criminality, and that this needs to be ventilated publicly. And 28 files went forward, and not a single one of them appeared to meet the threshold they set for prosecution. And I think for many people that tests their confidence in the DPP. Sir Iain, you said on the day of that decision that Kenova's position remains that we've recovered a huge amount of new material and made significant forensic breakthroughs. That includes obtaining new physical evidence, repurposing existing exhibits to obtain full DNA profiles. He said that you've also utilised cutting-edge techniques of fingerprint and DNA recovery on ballistics. Significant evidence linking numerous murder cases forensically for the first time. And then she said that many have shared new and significant evidence to strengthen our investigation. It goes on, but you clearly paint a picture of very strong and compelling evidence. You say that it has helped build a strong and compelling case, which we are frustrated will not now be tested before a court. Could I just ask both of you to outline your response to the PPSNI?
If I begin, so firstly, I know the PPS work really tirelessly to do their function of examining files that are submitted with regards to potential prosecutions. I don't think it's controversial for me to say I don't think they disagree, and I describe it in the report. I pored over every word of this report very carefully to try to be fair to everybody. I mean that, Claire, including the PPS. I've dealt with some really, really complicated cases in the past involving international terrorism, organised crime. If the same approach had been applied that the PPS have applied to legacy cases, to those cases, many of which are very well documented as stated cases for prosecutions, my previous history of successfully prosecuting those cases wouldn't be that history. They wouldn't have been prosecuted. I'm very clear on that. Very clear. Now, the mechanism that they adopted to look at these cases built in considerable delay, and it did not build in the level of relationship and communication between the independent investigative team and the independent prosecution authority and the independent counsel appointed to look at the evidence. And these cases are complicated. And I'll give you an example. When we first had a conversation about the admissibility of hearsay evidence, whenever you've got a case that is from some time ago, there is inevitably going to be a challenge around showing the continuity of certain evidence because people have passed away, or there may be a break in the chain of the integrity of exhibits. And I had a meeting with the PPS, and we had independent counsel from London who was very clear that, and the commentary he used was every day of the week at the Old Bailey I would get that evidence, hearsay evidence in. And there was a different view from the Public Prosecution Service in Northern Ireland. Now, for whatever we might say about the same legal processes being in place, Northern Ireland has a different way of approaching some of that evidence because legacy has become so challenging. Every case faces, either a judicial review or an appeal. Everything the PPS do. And in a way, I think the the imagination, almost the energy that I have engaged with prosecution authorities around complicated cases of, Al-Qaeda or organised crime gangs is absent on Legacy, because they're worn down by this legal battlefield that exists around if they make one decision or another. We didn't get, I don't think, to discuss and engage with each other about the details of that evidence in the way that I would have expected and hoped that we would. The very nature of the delay of making those decisions and the frustration of having to tell victims repeatedly we're still waiting. And there's an example where we were told we would get a decision by September of 2022. And we only got that decision very, very recently. And those families, we were told we could tell them we'd get the decision then. So all of that has been a huge frustration for the families, for us as investigating officers, but I will also say it's a frustration for the PPS as well. And I know Stephen Heron, and I reflected this in the report, in anticipation of the level of work that we would create as an investigative body looking at these cases, Stephen Heron asked for investment. Now, it was already probably too late to get that investment, to get those lawyers, because these are such specialist cases, you need specialist lawyers in my view. But he didn't get that investment. So again, legacy, and that's why these victims, at every juncture, they feel that they're let down. And something should have been put in place, which I, articulate in the report years ago, after the Good Friday Agreement. And again, it goes to one of Mr. Stewart's questions about, and it was recommendation 8, about the victim's views and well-being being taken into account by the Public Prosecution Service on these decisions. Just to articulate and explain my thinking on that, a number of families, knowing that files were with the PPS, were really concerned that there would be a prosecution, because they still live in those same communities. And there are still some challenges within those communities towards those families. And by having a prosecution, they felt that would bring towards them unwanted attention, unwanted media attention, and unwanted intimidation, and the sort of behaviours that I've described in the report that are entirely unacceptable in the past, at the time these offences occurred, and subsequently by members of the Republican movement. Abhorrent intimidation towards those families who'd done absolutely nothing wrong. So that recommendation, and I've discussed it with Stephen Heron, the Director of Public Prosecutions, is there to try to give the PPS some additional latitude, because if they have got a file for murder and there is such compelling evidence that they pass the first threshold test, that there is sufficient evidence to prosecute, if it's murder, they will prosecute that case. Just because the families feel that they may face intimidation does not currently, in the codes, provide the prosecutor with the flexibility of deciding not to prosecute on a public interest basis. And if you think of some of these cases and the origins of what happened, or the backstop of what happened with the Good Friday Agreement, many families saw murderers released. We all remember the images of these murderers coming out and being almost celebrated by their constituency. These families had to see that. And we've never really had a grown-up discussion with these families about what do you want out of this process. So recommendation 8 is from me speaking to a number of families to say, look, all we really want, what your job for us is to get the truth of what happened to our loved one. We do not want a prosecution. But there should be an independent process for that decision making. But I wanted to give the prosecution authority the additional wriggle room to consider those families' views, if this would be a life-changing decision for them to continue living in that community if there was a prosecution.
Iain?
Thank you. My reflection, I think, would be, 3 legal systems in the United Kingdom: Scotland, Northern Ireland, and England and Wales, and there's different procedural elements and different bits of substantive law. But my observation is that the approach, we've often said, if this was a murder in Glasgow or a murder in London or a murder in Belfast or a serious case, the police side, the senior investigating officer, the prosecution team, whether it's the CPS in England or the Crown and Procurator Fiscal Service in Scotland, and then an independent prosecuting barrister, their involvement seems to come a lot earlier in the process, has been my experience. So questions that the prosecution team may have, or the prosecuting KC, can be addressed at the time. And you can say to the SIO, what do you mean by that? Yes. Can you go and get a bit more information on that? I think in the experience of Kenova has been that the passage of time, it seems to be more siloed as an observation, just as a process. Now, maybe for very good reason, maybe because of experience, maybe because of volume, it's just different from what happens in the rest of the United Kingdom when it comes to investigating serious and complex crime, where the involvement of the SIO and the prosecution team, including the prosecuting counsel, comes much earlier in the process.
Would you think it's fair to say we're talking about two different things here? We're talking about, one, the lack of resourcing, which I think is well documented, and we're talking about difference in processing and at the stage of, or the level of cooperation between investigators and the DPP. But are we also talking about a preemptive decision to remove the concept of prosecutions?
If I can come in, I think, to be fair to the prosecution service, the two are connected, I think, Claire. Because of the lack of resources, and I hope my language isn't clumsy, the legacy cases that we submitted went to the back of the queue because they had lots of contemporary issues to deal with. Public protection files around sexual offences today, serious crimes today. Northern Ireland, has certain challenges still around distant republicanism. If I look at the way that the investigation and prosecution relationship was with the attempted murder on John Caldwell last February, having arrived as the Chief Constable, that was more akin to the relationship that Iain has described that we would expect to see. But I think because of resources and because of their capacity, they can't apply that standard, that level of responsiveness for legacy cases, probably based on the fact that by and large, and certainly in the cases we were dealing with, there was no obvious threat from the people who we suspected of committing these crimes. So they didn't need to deal with them in the same timely fashion as they had to deal with other files that we're looking at, where there were bail conditions or ongoing prosecution. So again, because of the bandwidth of the PPS, they simply weren't able to adopt that process, which we'd agreed they would adopt, the process I described at the beginning. But that changed because they simply weren't able to support and resource that. And I think that would be what Stephen Heron would say if he sat here today.
That's a tone for what's coming, though. I wanted to also pick up on neither confirm nor deny. In the interim report, you suggest, as I read it, that policy is applied almost universally on any interaction rather than on a more case-by-case basis, and suggest that it shouldn't be applied to disclosure to secure vetted bodies like Kenova or like a future legacy body, and you have that as a recommendation to review, codify and define proper limits to NCND as it relates to agents. And I think you link the lack of prosecutions to a fairly dogmatic application of that policy. So within 30 days of you making that recommendation, the UK government have given a little bit of response in terms of the Secretary of State going to the High Court to challenge the decision on this. That looks like a fairly aggressive response from London, that they will continue to decide what does and doesn't get disclosed, and likely therefore that the needs of victims and survivors who you've championed in Kenova will again and continue to be secondary to the needs of state and Republican and loyalist interests. What do you think that tells us about the future of the body that's due to come into effect next week?
Well, firstly, there's ongoing legal proceedings, and just to contextualise your question, I have taken, since arriving as the Chief Constable, because of the experiences I've had, quite a forensic view on how we were dealing with the remaining inquests that were to take place before those inquests had to finish for the commencement of the commission on the 1st of May. And that included me looking at the process that's been adopted on public interest immunity applications. And my background as head of covert policing, undercover policing, I have done a considerable amount of public interest immunity applications and dealt with every type of sensitive information that is available to intelligence agencies and law enforcement. I have taken a very clear position that this totemic approach in Northern Ireland, and I describe it in those terms in the report, is not correct. And what it leads to, and it's often driven by lawyers, what it leads to, as the Chief Constable of the PSNI, is a perception in communities in Northern Ireland that there is a cover-up. That people are deliberately, the authorities are deliberately preventing information from coming out. Now, the Kenova report says throughout it that I was in awe of the way the security forces dealt with the Troubles. They, being a member of the RUC to begin with, and I found a United Nations report on this, it outlined how, being such a member of the RUC, it was the most dangerous police force in the world to be a member of. Over 300 officers were murdered. Over 300 officers were subjected to terrorist attacks where they received life-changing injuries. I am a huge advocate for what the security forces did during the Troubles. But where we got things wrong, as we were inevitably going to do in such an incredibly difficult operating environment, where on occasions, and my whole background is operational, whatever the decision that was going to be taken, there was going to be a loss of life. We should be open to scrutiny so that we can make sure we learn the lessons of that operational activity, but also how we have managed agents during that process. And by this absolute position of refusing to in any way concede any information, even internally, to legally constituted commissioned investigations, it has fed this narrative of collusion and conspiracy, where what I find when I've looked at all the information is that generally it doesn't prove there's any collusion or conspiracy. It shows actually that often the security forces did a great job, but where there is a problem, do not hide it. That's what sets us apart as a democracy. And in the report, at page 144, we're not the first people to see this. When I spoke to Dave Cox before I gave evidence at this committee, Dave Cox, who's the former head of the Historical Inquiries team, said, I quote, "They," and he was talking about the PSNI then, "always gave me a limited version of the truth. They invariably did not and will not give up information. Lord Stevens, referring to the security forces, I was misled deliberately. I was criminally obstructed from doing my job by the RUC and military, whilst MI5 failed to disclose information." I followed up on all these to make sure these examples are accurate and true. Rennie Pomerantz, the senior counsel to Judge Corey, "We could not compel material being provided. Others controlled what we received and when and how we received it and the conditions in which we received it. They, MI5, made the entire process uncomfortable. The state viewed itself as above the law." And finally, Mary Laverty was senior counsel to Judge Smithick for the Smithick Tribunal. "They, the security forces, made it incredibly hard. When will they decide they can reveal information?" Now, when the public reads that, they're only left with one impression, and all of the incredible work and the sacrifice of security forces is lost. So I am taking a view, and I think legally I've sought, obviously, very senior counsel advice, and I'm at odds here with the Secretary of State, that we can give some information, but we cannot breach NCND where we will give the details of who an agent is. We can't put anybody's lives at risk. But by this iron curtain approach, it leads to a lack of trust and confidence towards the security forces. And it's unnecessary. And the world has moved on from there. as I try to describe in the report, particularly at sections 47 and 48.
I don't think we're in disagreement here, and I think you said at a previous appearance at this committee that sometimes the myths that have been created are, in some cases, worse than the reality. But it does dishonour, and by the way, I say this as somebody who came from a community that didn't have belief in the police force. I absolutely believe that so many people put on a uniform and went out to protect and serve the community with honour, but I think it dishonours them whenever there isn't any honesty or transparency or disclosure about those, and there were many who did not do that, and I do believe that the dogmatic application it drives that mythology and will prevent reconciliation. I wanted to ask you, Sir Iain, about the same thing, about that application, including the Secretary of State's legal action, including the Secretary of State's letter to the Chief Constable, which was reported in the Irish News a week or two ago. What does that tell you about the application, and do you think that creates confidence in the body that's coming into effect next month or next week, and in London's interest in any way in actually getting to the truth and not just sparing the embarrassment of the people who did the murdering?
I mentioned or alluded to this a little bit earlier when I was answering one of Bob Stewart's questions on the recommendations, that I think there is absolutely a need for a detailed and informed review of NCND as a policy. We understand the rationale that lies behind it. In general terms, it served its purpose very well in terms of protecting the identity of sources and ensuring that the operations of not only investigations but actually work of intelligence agencies across the world can be maintained, because part of the rationale for NCND is that if you don't uphold it, it's going to be difficult for people to give information. And I think a lot of people who gave information, again, I think as John has alluded to, it was a very brave thing to do, to come forward to support the forces of law and order who were trying to do the right thing, as you said, not always getting it right. And that's what we need to focus upon. That actually some of the behaviour was outstanding, was bravery beyond anyone's comprehension, but at other times it was not, and it costs life. And I don't think recognising one means it precludes you recognising the other. I think we have to do that. So I think that this is the right time for a review of NCND, how it operates, how it is implemented in practice, some of the issues that John's currently having within the coronial process in Northern Ireland, and some of the conversations that are ongoing, I think just underlines how there is a lack of certainty about what NCND is, what it means and how it's applied.
I'm going to finish in, but do you think the Secretary of State's intervention, going to court and the letter he sent, do you think that sets the tone right? Do you think that creates any confidence in what's to come in terms of London's approach to disclosure?
Well, I think it's indicative of the challenges and the different perspectives that exist in regard to NCND. I still think the Secretary of State will be getting briefed from his officials and others that this is a policy and a doctrine that must be defended at all causes. We probably have a different view. We think that there's a need for it to be applied in an appropriate manner and for there to be a clearer understanding. But I personally don't think there's any lack of commitment in terms of supporting the work of the Commission. But as ever, the proof will be in the pudding.
I would just I did respond to the Secretary of State in very clear terms about my position. And, it's the issue that I have issue with, not the individual. And that's part of the democratic process. I'm probably bringing a new challenge now because this is the way it's always been done. And of course, when you go into a new role and somebody says, well, this is the way we do things, and because of my background and experience, I question, well, is that right? And what NCND cannot do, there is no immunity process. Nobody can have immunity in this country unless it's through provisions of things like SOCPA, specific legislation that provide for that. And by saying that you can't investigate a crime any further because there's an agent involved, that's poppycock. Yeah. That's not right. And I think there has been an application of NCND in Northern Ireland which has restricted previous chief constables and investigators, and through the narrative that I described from these very incredibly impressive people who've dealt with legacy in the past, that has created a position that has inhibited us freeing ourselves from some of this legacy. It's like an anchor that holds us back. And the NCND provisions, I think, are part of that. And that's why all I'm asking for them is to be reviewed and recodified within the context of the Northern Ireland Troubles. And nobody who commits murders should be protected by the policy of NCND. I don't think anybody could disagree with that.
I agree. I think that the point is, it isn't just saying, well, this is the way we've always done it. The context is the government saying, we're taking a whole new approach. It's about truth. It's about reconciliation, but yet applying the same restrictive, dogmatic policy that has thwarted truth and reconciliation for 5 decades. I just wanted, Judith, briefly to ask you what I suppose what learnings and lessons there are for the process to come from Kenova and managing what may be perceived as a tension between truth recovery, reconciliation, and prosecutions.
Thank you, Claire. The whole raison d'etre of the Victims Focus Group, it's an international group, it's an independent group, it's a group of people whose focus and expertise is around support for victims. So the conversation we've just had here lands very strangely in that group. Because if your fundamental starting point is any process going forward must be focused on those who are harmed, across the board, from all communities, no matter who by. If that's your starting point, and you're operating in a situation where people's experience is that we've just heard about, where they are back of the queue, they have so much practice at being back of the queue, they expect to be back of the queue. Their expectations of the justice system are in many cases incredibly low. And a process of building trust and faith and reconciliation has to start with meeting the needs of those people and thereby building trust in a justice system and in a government, giving people a sense that their suffering mattered, and recognising that if you don't be transparent, that if you don't deal with the issues, you give the opposite message. And you continue to give that opposite message to people's children and their grandchildren. So if you think about conflict, and you think about the legacy of conflict, and you think of the harm that is done in families, and then passed on from one generation to the next, and held in communities, then the importance of doing what John and Sir Iain have talked about, and building confidence in justice, building confidence in the government, by implication. It's of such fundamental importance that it has to be the starting point, and only not met where there's a reason for default so strong that people don't understand it, and people will. People are incredibly realistic when it comes to it. They have learned to be through hard experience. But it's upside down to start with the reasons why you can't be transparent, where you know that you can't build reconciliation, you can't build faith and justice, unless your starting point is transparency. The raison d'etre for having a victim focus group and the other governance group that John talked about were about transparency, about building faith and justice, about having a robust challenge to a robust investigation process. And in terms of your second part of the question about going forward, we think that's incredibly important learning. So taking it from the start, really, we have got in this report a very clear statement that misinformation does incredible harm. You know, that wrong information failure to disclose, failure to be transparent, failure to engage with the past and with victims and survivors does harm now and needs to change. Any new body has to start with the victim-centred approach, has to deal with absence of trust and confidence through transparency and also by oversight. So external oversight, absolutely fundamental to anything going forward. I'm also going to say leadership. You know, the leadership style in Kenova from John Boutcher and Sir Iain has been victim-focused. And that has told in the way they're perceived. And I have to say, it's been evident in the excellent staff they have used and the processes and the feedback we get about the way the family liaison officers have worked with families in this case is transformational in terms of their view of Kenova, but also of what justice could deliver. So the learning is that it's transparency, it's being genuinely victim-focused. It's about building in independent oversight, having leadership, which is properly victim-focused too. And at the end of the day, just always recognising that legitimacy builds trust. And trust builds cooperation and collaboration, and ultimately probably will be the aim, the expectation and the hope is that will build reconciliation. We know that doing the opposite certainly doesn't build reconciliation. And at the end of the day, this is just too important an enterprise to let it be derailed by formulaic thinking and reluctance to disclose.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Agreed.
Thank you. Stephen Farrell.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning to all of our witnesses. I'm going to ask a few questions about steak and knife in particular in a moment, but I just want to pick up on a couple of things that have been said so far. The first thing is, in relation to the recommendations arising from the interim report, was your hope expectation that those would be picked up straight away by the responsible actors? Obviously, some of them will be quite long to take forward, or are they just there for largely for noting pending the final report to be published in due course, maybe before the end of the year, or not?
So when I wrote the recommendations, I was realistic around the amount of time it would take for people to absorb the report, sort of consider it with great care. And although the recommendations are fairly succinct in them only being 10, I was very alive to the fact that this was going to be quite challenging, asking for apologies from the Republican movement and from the British government around what's happened. And don't forget, just in this process, what's not in this report, because it's very high level, is through the protocol process I've described, I Maxwellised, I did a representations process with all of the security forces, certain individuals, where I set out information that I had to substantiate this report. I then did a security checking exercise where I got all of the security forces in. It was choreographed by the Cabinet Office, and I went into great detail about the examples that sit behind the findings in this report. And there are a number of them, giving them the circumstances of how people came to lose their lives and we didn't act in the way that we should have acted. Now this is, you know, I'm very realistic around this. This is quite an ask. I have to say I was a little bit disappointed with the comments from the government around, you know, there are ongoing civil cases, all of this sort of almost playing it into the long grass with regards to an informed response. I think the victims are owed more than that. But I do accept that there is a final report still to come. On the basis of what's in this interim report, I think the government could have said more. I hope they'd say more. But these cases have took place so long ago. There has been so much work that's gone into getting us to this point. You know, I probably didn't expect anything to happen in the short term. But I certainly hope, whether it's between now and the final report coming out, or upon the publication of the final report, we'll be in a position through Iain's work that by and large these recommendations will have been adhered to. And, you know, it is going to take a bit of time to do some of these. And by way of example, the recommendation I say about lowering the classification of a number of previous legacy reports, that goes to Claire's point in a way around legitimacy and trust. I've read all of those reports, every word in those reports. With some editing, some redaction, but not significant redaction, the messages, the findings of those reports can be put in the public domain, and they don't breach national security provisions with that caveat that some minor editing would occur. And that would take us again on the road to a level of transparency, an openness to scrutiny and reconciliation that we have fiercely guarded against. So I know the landscape around these recommendations is going to be challenging, but I do see signs of people accepting a lot of what I've said privately. So ultimately, I hope that when Iain's final report comes out, if we've not already achieved a lot of these recommendations being complied with, we'll then achieve what the recommendations require.
Judith or Iain want to add anything to that point on the recommendations more generally?
Just again, to reiterate the point I made earlier, that the Cabinet Office have taken responsibility from the government's perspective in terms of the coordination of responses, because so many of these issues sit across that. And I am going to be very active about looking for an update. So when we report, exactly as John said, it will be an update on where the recommendations are. You know, hopefully discharged, partially discharged, and just exactly what the implications have been.
Judith?
I think just to say that some of what is in that report goes a lot further than an investigation or prosecution or a court case could, and goes from robust investigative evidence into recommendations for apologies, recommendations for a day of reflection. I think that's an incredibly important and significantly different step from a kind of a normal justice process. I think those things must be delivered in a victim-centred, victim-led way. And it might sound obvious, but it's not always. You know, apologies can be used as a substitute or even sometimes to obfuscate access to full disclosure and truth or access to other rights. It's incredibly important that, and I hope we do, move forward towards apologies, that victims and survivors and their representatives are absolutely involved in all the discussions of what the apologies should say, and that they are specific, and that they include not only original wrongs, but the many failures, I think, of the system, and the failures in communities that we've talked about, to support and acknowledge those people. So I would say complex, difficult, challenging, and really important stuff that needs to be done in collaboration with victims and survivors. And the same thing about days of reflection. There are a number of really moving events around. Yes. People must feel there isn't a competition with what's there already. It's got to be something everyone buys into. Yeah. So yes, victim-centred approach in all of it.
On the day of reflection in particular, I mean, you see that as a bottom-up process, that society of victims in particular will drive it. It can't be a top-down. Government says this is obviously given.
At the end of the day, they may wish the statement come from somebody who has the authority to speak for the government or organisation they're speaking for. But what is said, how it's delivered, where it's delivered, and how they are involved in the process of delivery, that is victims and survivors to feel they have, ownership.
Thank you. And John, just moving on, you just said there a few moments ago that you would potentially like to see NCND recodified at some point. That sort of begs the question, is this actually codified anywhere on a piece of paper, and by whom, or is this largely a convention that can be elastic if people want it to be elastic, or it can be tight if people want it to be tight?
So no, there is a policy that's owned by the Cabinet Office for NCND. It's a policy. People talk about a legal principle. It's a policy. Policies change all the time, or should evolve. You know, I will say, Iain mentioned it earlier, I have applied NCND throughout my professional career, but not in the totemic way. This is a new experience for me, that it's been applied in Northern Ireland. And look, I understand the reasons for it. I understand the history. You know, incredibly challenging environment that the security forces faced. And I have so much sympathy for what they endured and the threats that you know, they encountered and the sacrifices that they made. My frustrations come from post the Good Friday Agreement and our approach to then the scrutiny that we would expect in a democracy about how we as state actors responded to these events. And I'm not talking about looking at individual culpability and responsibility. I'm talking about lessons learned. And by the application as it currently is in Northern Ireland, I think firstly inhibits lessons learned. Secondly, it definitely provides a challenge for us around trust and confidence for communities, including some of the members of the security forces as well, not just the nationalist community, which automatically you consider would have a really strong view on this. And so looking at it just within the context of the Troubles, and remember there was no legal framework to deal with agent handling during the Troubles. Yes. There was a guidance document that was issued in the Home Office in 1969 that was inherently unsuitable for dealing with the complexity of the Troubles. So to put all of that into context, to look at how NCND is applied and to make sure that the principles of rule of law and public interest are both considered, to provide a new framework as to how we deal with NCND within the concept of the Troubles within that period, I think is long overdue. And I made the comment earlier, nobody would expect NCND to provide a protection or an immunity to murderers. But the report sets this out. That is in effect what has happened. Yeah. And I don't think any of us would agree with that. And I think it's just time to put that right.
This will be an incredibly difficult question to answer, just given some of the very particular circumstances in Northern Ireland and the UK facing domestic terrorism. But does the UK's approach to NCND equate to what other jurisdictions, particularly Western liberal democracies, would be doing, or is it more tight or more loose? For example, compared to USA or Canada?
So the Five Eyes, yep. The UK, US, Canada, Australia and New Zealand have more or less a similar approach to NCND. NCND, and I describe it in the report, the origins of it are with a story about the Glomar Explorer, which was a CIA spy ship that sought to salvage a lost Russian submarine. And the administration in America at the time, the Nixon administration, when they were challenged by the media, who believed this was a spy ship, used the term, it's the first time we can find a trace of it, we'll neither confirm nor deny. Subsequently, the Carter administration changed the position on that. And that's the example of how things can change, okay, in the face of overwhelming evidence and information. What I would say, my view, in my judgment, and you know, time will tell as to how this plays out with legal challenge. The approach in Northern Ireland is one that I don't recognise from my experiences in England and Wales and other jurisdictions in the actual, you know, ironclad position around NCND. Yes. I understand where it comes from, but I think it's time now to ask the questions about the correctness of it. And that's what I've sought to do through the report, because the consequences of it have meant that investigations haven't occurred that probably should have occurred. Yeah. And even the very nature, there was allegations put to John Stevens that that the agent Stakeknife had committed an offence of perjury. And when that was looked at to be investigated, the comment was, well, this is national security, we can't investigate it. Again, because this approach, anything to do with agents or suspected agents, there's this ring of steel. Now, that relies on two things. Firstly, that the security forces have acted properly. And secondly, that the agents have complied with the rule of law. They've not committed serious offences. We know from the Kenova cases that that wasn't necessarily the case in every instance. And that's why I think we need to review NCND with regards to how it was applied during the Troubles.
Yeah. Well, that leads on neatly to one of the questions I wanted to ask, which is around the approach adopted by the security forces, whereby the protection of certain agents either perceived or in reality took precedence over the dissemination of life-saving information. And I mean, to what extent that was a formal policy or a culture at the time when steak knife was...
So we never found anything, if you like, and bear in mind it was an incredibly difficult environment, and you had different people in the different agencies at different periods of time. This was something that emerged almost, well, as a culture, as a way of doing business. And I described that in the report. There wasn't, for want of a better description, a coordinating hand sitting above all of these different agencies saying this is how we're going to do things. There was an absence of a legal framework. A number of the security forces, and we documented this during our investigations, asked for a legal framework and didn't get one as to providing, helpful and up-to-date guidance about how they could operate within a legislative framework to deal with agents. That wasn't provided. So effectively you had people at the front end who were exposed to risk, almost making up as they went along. Mm-hmm. There was no oversight that we see now in today's security forces, in today's society generally. There wasn't that rigour. Mm-hmm. So no legal framework, no governance, no oversight. What you was left with was these girls and guys in the security forces doing their very best. And on occasions, some of them didn't behave as we would want them to behave.
I'm familiar that the retired police officer, REC, largely REC Special Branch, do tell that they did approach number 10 in relation to that, and at the time Margaret Thatcher declined the request to codify this.
So I spoke to the officer who did that when Margaret Thatcher did a morale boosting visit to Northern Ireland to speak to the security forces. I think Mrs Thatcher did actually probe as to what could be done about this, and effectively nothing was done. Also, Sir Iain mentioned John Chilcott. John Chilcott at one stage, sadly passed away now, he talked to us about how he led a piece of work to seek to get a legal framework. But again, it was decided in government, I think because of the timeliness towards what was then hoped would be a peace agreement, that work never actually progressed to any legal framework. And the legal framework that ultimately arrived wasn't until 2000 with RIPA, the Regulation Investigation Powers Act, which is the first time we saw any statutory basis as to how to deal with agents.
How rigorous do you think RIPA is today that it would have prevented the situation that arose with steak knife? Is RIPA an absolute shield, or is it better but not entirely?
So there's not just RIPA now. Yeah. There's various other pieces of legislation that have come in to support RIPA. And RIPA has been amended and improved. Also, there's been the modernisation of policing from a police perspective. There is also now, with regards to an authorisation process and an oversight process, you have IPCRA, so you have judge-led oversight bodies that come and look at authorisations that are done with regards to agents, how we deal generally with intrusive surveillance, to make sure that...
We're conscious of a case working its way through in terms of the Investigative Powers Tribunal at the moment in that respect?
There is at the moment, in regard to Northern Ireland, there is indeed. But what I'm saying is those processes and the IPT, which is a statutory body set up so that complaints could be made where citizens have got concerns about the use of intrusive surveillance by state bodies. You've got all of these safeguards now that you never had before. And I would say it almost entirely makes the behaviours that we saw during the Troubles of agents in what was a uniquely difficult time, almost impossible. But you can never, ever cater for what a human being will do with all of those safeguards in place. But if anybody did do something of a criminal nature, of a serious criminal nature, as a CHIS, a covert human intelligence source, as defined by the RIPA legislation, that would quickly be identified, quickly be addressed, and they would be treated as a criminal. They would be investigated as a criminal.
Two final questions, Chair, just on steak knife in particular. The first one is, what was the understanding of the purpose under which steak knife was recruited? Was it to be of assistance in criminal investigations, or was it for other purposes, or was that ever understood at the time, or was it left ambiguous? And secondly, I mean, we have a lot of players in the intelligence sphere at the time, between Force Research Unit, REC Special Branch, perhaps to a lot lesser extent at that time, MI5. And how does the running of agents work when you have those different agencies at play, sometimes maybe reinforcing each other, sometimes maybe contradicting each other?
Yeah, so the first question, with regards to steak knife and the, if you like, the background with regards to his recruitment, that they are issues that we're seeking to address in the final report through Sir Iain. And that has to go through a due process with the Cabinet Office, with the permissions that we're seeking to get that agreed. With regards to the operating practices, and obviously there's two periods that are relevant. There's the periods during the Troubles, and at different times there are different operating processes between the military, particularly the Force Research Unit, Special Branch, and MI5. I would say that at the time, notwithstanding the best efforts of many of the people involved with regards to the security forces, there were times, and we've spoken to those individuals at length, where things just didn't work because of personalities, a lack of a framework, and that led to being that was one of the major contributing factors to the situation that we had with the agent steak knife. Today, we do have really robust, I'm confident, really robust processes where there's proper deconfliction. There is a transparency of sharing of intelligence with regards to national security threats in that particular arena that has come from previous experiences and learning best practice that I would say are very robust indeed, that would prevent, again, some of the elements of what we've seen in the themes that we identified in the steak knife report. So I'm assured that we wouldn't see those sorts of lack of cooperation, sharing of intelligence that we saw on occasions during the conflict. And that's why I think there's a justification to look at the period of the Troubles with regards to NCND as a specific and separate case.
John, would that ever get to the stage of one agency saying my agent is more important than your agent?
Sorry, say that again.
Would that ever get to the situation where a certain agency would say that the agent we're running is more important than the agent that your group is running?
Well, today, no. I don't think that would happen. I think there are due processes to make sure that, if you like, that almost, I'll describe it as our agent is, the possession of our agent and the utility and the equity of our agent is more important than yours, therefore we're going to take these actions. There's a very grown-up process to deal with those issues. With regards to the period of during the Troubles, there was, and this will be described in the final report, there were occasions where one agency would have an agent and their approach and their management of that agent would have a primary regard to that agent's safety over and above other agents that were with other agencies. So there was something there with regards to a failure of individuals in certain intelligence agencies from sharing information because it wasn't about their agents. It wasn't going to benefit their agents or their agency. And a lot of that was driven by personalities. And you must remember what the position taken was that the continuance of the intelligence from that agent was the overriding priority. To be able to secure the life of that agent, their agent, over and above everything else, took precedent, so that they could continue receiving information from that agent. So nobody was looking at this holistically about the benefits and the consequences of having that agent over this protracted period of time. Those processes, that oversight, wasn't in place, and it wasn't in place because it was the most chaotic time. We've moved on, remarkably from those times, but there were occasions where, without doubt, people took decisions within certain intelligence agencies for the benefit of that particular intelligence unit and their agent over and above other agents that would sit with other agencies.
In the interest of the criminal justice system, presumably, as well.
If I just say, at times, because of the threat from particularly the provisional IRA, and I described this in the report, I think the security forces on occasions were just focused on trying to protect society. The rule of law was secondary. It was so difficult for them, it was so dangerous for them. You couldn't investigate these cases properly because of the threats to the security forces, because one half of the community, one half of society couldn't be seen to be speaking to the security forces. It wasn't safe even to try to get forensic information at a scene because of the intimidation and the threats to those agencies. And because of the very nature of how intelligence was collected, there might be very, very important information about a really iconic attack. And to protect an agent who'd given that information, that intelligence would not be passed to the senior investigating officer, would not be passed to the detectives, because the fear was if the detectives acted on it, by this mosaic approach, the IRA, who were extremely skilled in identifying agents and locating agents, would then, and this is to the heart of Operation Kenova, the internal security unit, would find that agent and would murder them. So this focus about protecting the agent at all costs did have consequences. But looking at it, you can understand how that position came to be. I don't agree with it, but I can understand how it came to be.
Thank you.
Thank you. Carla Lockhart.
Thank you, and thank you to the panel for your endurance with us. Just a few questions on the back of what has been said. I don't want to rehearse lots of what has been said. I suppose one of the big things is really the cost of the report and the fact that there are no prosecutions. So just around the PPS, and just keen again to understand, we talk about more resources and all of that. But do you believe, I suppose this is for you, John, do you believe the PPS could have discharged their duties in assessing the Kenova files in a more timely fashion? I think you gave the example of, 2022, and they weren't forthcoming until a lot later. Do you feel that there could have been more effort in that regard? During the investigation as well, do you actually feel, or had you any concern around impartiality within the PPS? And do you feel that there is a double standard in how the PPS addressed contemporary and historic terrorism-related files? And I think you give the example of John Caldwell. Do you feel that has had a big bearing on the contents of the report? So it's just around the PPS.
Yeah, so I'll try and take those in order. Around impartiality, from everything I know, I'm entirely satisfied that the Public Prosecution Service in Northern Ireland are impartial with regards to how they approach these cases. I think there is, and I'll describe this briefly, there is a tiredness of legacy with lawyers where there's this legal, it's almost an industry with regards to appeals through, you may be well aware, Carla, that until very recently, we had to go through old-style type committals in Northern Ireland prosecution cases to test the evidence at an early stage at Magistrates' Court. Whatever the decision in a legacy case, either one constituency or the other constituency would appeal that. And the lawyers have this almost I think it's almost like a marathon for every single case that they face around legacy. And if we do get a decision to prosecute a legacy investigation, we did some casework, and they take 5 to 7 years to come to a conclusion, whether that's a successful conclusion or not. So I think there is something about legacy being the poor relation of cases within the Public Prosecution Service caseload, but that's not necessarily, I don't blame them for that. I think that comes from other factors over many years, and we talk about investment, but I also think structures and approach to those cases. I talk about in the report how advantageous I think it would be to have a unit dedicated to legacy cases because of the nuances of the legal issues that are consistently in legacy cases. The timing issue, again, I think I've sort of spoken to this, but simply because, again, these cases were looked at by these lawyers who had significant other casework to do at the time. I would have expected, because of the seriousness of legacy to me, that there would have been dedicated lawyers only looking at these cases, who would know them forensically, who would be speaking to my case officers and discussing the strengths and weaknesses of certain aspects of those files, who would be speaking to counsel about issues such as hearsay evidence. How can we address this? How can we be audacious in what we're going to do around these cases? And that simply didn't happen. But again, I know Stephen Heron, who I have a huge amount of respect for, would say we simply didn't have the capacity to do any of that.
Was there ever a push back on that, in terms of, the PPS recognising they obviously didn't have the resources, although resources is one thing, but, just delay, it feels like a lot of it was delay, maybe more so than the resources side. Was there a pushback with you on that, about more resources, about a more targeted approach within the PPS? Did they recognise, just as you say, the seriousness of it?
I think they were as frustrated as us. What I will say is I will not agree with Stephen on the nature of the compelling evidence that I think we gathered, which Sir Iain commented on publicly. And, I would hope that we'll be able to address this in the final report, some of the detail of the information as admissible evidence that we managed to achieve. Of all the files that we submitted, taking into account the challenges, the evidential challenges, the witness evidence challenges in Northern Ireland, I expected there to be 3 or 4 prosecutions for certain matters. I talk in the report around the perjury cases, and if you look at that section with care, I expected there to be a prosecution there, and there was a particular stance taken legally on a technical point with regards to the perjury. And all of these things, the sort of consequences that families see that everything's against them. The timing is taking too long, the decisions aren't right. What I will say, and I need to underscore this, the independence, the mindset of the individuals, the lawyers in the PPS, was, I'm absolutely certain, entirely independent with regards to the process. But I said to Stephen recently, I've been reviewed, as in Kenova, by a number of independent bodies. One of the recommendations I have is that the way the PPS have dealt with the legacy cases, the Kenova cases, and in fact review Kenova, have a look at how we've dealt with these cases, should be independently examined. And I think there's a concern about that, because I'm sure, even though we've been reviewed by the National Police Chiefs Council Homicide Working Group, we've been reviewed by a barrister with regards to our approach to investigations and our compliance with Article 2 of ECHR. I'm sure a review of Kenova and how we interacted with the PPS would identify learning, and I welcome that, because that helps us. That's this continuous learning that we should be on. But I think it would help the PPS to understand that maybe there are other ways, noting that investment is a key issue and the number of lawyers that they need, but there would have been other ways to do these cases, which maybe would have presented a different outcome. So I would just welcome that sort of independent examination of how the cases were managed.
I think that's really helpful. Probably something that we can press for as well. Just, I suppose, an important summary within the document was, and I'll quote this because I think it's an important paragraph, I continue to emphasise that in the context of our core Kenova investigations, the original IRA's actions were the most shameful and evil I have encountered. No doubt others will seek to emphasise the failures of the security forces and the state. However, it was the IRA leadership that commissioned and sanctioned these activities that its ISU carried out. It was the IRA that committed the brutal acts of torture and murder, each evil act being the epitome of cowardice. Senior Republicans who condoned and still condone these activities are reprehensible. The Republican leadership should acknowledge and accept these crimes were wrong and apologise to victims and families of those tortured and murdered. I think that is such a powerful paragraph because it's just a reminder that, you know, it was the brutality of the terrorists that is really at the core of all of this. So do you believe that the blanket statement by the First Minister that she is sorry for all loss of life during the Troubles goes far enough to meeting the recommendation in the interim report, and that the Republican leadership should acknowledge and accept these crimes were wrong and to apologise to the families of those tortured and murdered? So do you really feel it went far enough?
Well, firstly, I mentioned before, I pored over every word of this report, and I stand by everything I wrote that you read out. Okay, what the IRA did to those families, the Internal Security Unit, they were out of, you know, even with the context of the wickedness of the IRA, that Internal Security Unit took evil acts to a new level. And, you know, I've mentioned this before, they also, outside of the actions they took against people they claim were informants, a number of which were not informants, and they knew they were not informants, they also then took action against family members, people with significant learning difficulties, children who are associated with these victims. And I know and have had personal testimony around a number of those cases, and those families remain obviously incredibly traumatised but also still intimidated by all of that. So, you know, I very much endorse again what I wrote in the report. With regards to the apology from the First Minister, I was pleased that the First Minister came out that day and spoke publicly about the Kenova report. Judith, I think in this session, has articulated far better than I could about the importance of those apologies being very much victim focused and agreed with victims as to what victims want to hear. And both with regards to the Republican movement and the UK government, I would endorse what Judith said around how those apologies should be done. They should be done once, and they should be done properly, and they should be done with the support and involvement of those victims. And that's something I think we're yet to see. But I was pleased, very pleased, that the First Minister took the step to come out and speak publicly on the day.
Judith, do you want to maybe pick up on that? Do you feel it went far enough? You are obviously in continuing contact with victims. It wasn't victim-centred, and certainly there didn't appear to be. It was very bland, and I'm just keen to get your views.
I think, as John has said, and from the report asked for apologies from both the British government and the leadership of the IRA. The statement that was made was, a look maybe in the right direction, but it wouldn't meet the criteria for an apology as it would be accepted in any kind of international or actually previous Northern Ireland practice, in that you have to be specific about who you're apologising to. You need to be specific about what you're apologising for. It has to be unequivocal. It has to include all aspects of the activity you're apologising for, and it needs to be delivered in a way which is agreed with and, in fact, led by the wishes, needs and rights of those who are harmed. So that's a process that hasn't started yet, really, in the kind of way it's envisaged in this report and the way it would be understood as an apology, which, properly marks full recognition and responsibility for the harm done in all aspects. And then you need follow through, don't you? It's, does that then bring us to a place where there is a future, fuller recognition and honestness and openness about the past on all parts? There are lots of things that have been talked about here that can build for education and communities and how we look back in the future. So it's a complex process. No, I don't think that what was given would constitute, an apology in those terms. But it is good that the word and the notion was present.
But it was simply a nod. Didn't go far enough, and I accept that. And just in relation then just to that sort of continual glorification, and I think you've touched on it there, the need, you'll know them by their actions. So just the impact, that has just on victims, and, how I believe we need to go further as a government in relation to glorification and that continual glorifying of terrorism.
I believe that when I talked about follow through there, a lot of what you say, and again on all parts, I think where apologies are owed by the British government, as outlined in the report, they need to account for not only the actions that took place at the time or failure to act that took place at the time, but also for the continued failures of the justice system and government to address the needs of victims and survivors. So, that would be a full scope for an apology, and absolutely the same where, the IRA needs to deal with the issues around the torture and murder of people they believe to be informers, and then the stigmatisation and intimidation of their families to this day. That, those are things which need to be dealt with in the round. And going forward, I guess when that's happened, you hope that the glorification of any party to conflict should not happen in the same way. Because if you've got an honest look backwards at what happened, it's not glorious from any part. And I think, the need to move forward in a way that harm is seen as harm, and narratives from the past, from whatever quarter, are not glorified in a way that justifies future violence. That's incredibly important, and it's the heart of where you want to get to.
And that is the fear, that sort of justifying it in young people's minds, that that it's okay, that it's justified. So thank you for that. Just moving very quickly and almost through, just in relation then to the security forces, and obviously so many security forces put on the uniform, did a superb job. They were a human shield between good and evil. And I think we always need to be mindful that over 90% of the murders throughout the Trouble, were by terrorists. And there's always that sort of desire to rewrite history and nearly blot out that it was this, a justified war that these terrorists were fighting. So just probably back to you, John. Do you believe sort of the criticisms of the security forces should be viewed in the context of the unprecedented pressure that they were under, and that brutality of the terrorist campaign at that time? So do you really feel that should always be underpinning the security force?
What I tried to do throughout the report, and I was very conscious of it, was to make sure that we didn't rewrite history. You read a passage earlier that I answered you that I wrote, and that's quite dramatic language. I wrote every word very carefully as to what I've seen that the IRA did. And I have constantly endorsed the response from the security forces during the Troubles in everything I've seen. I spend a lot of time now as a Chief Constable seeing people who've been impacted by the Troubles from a security forces perspective, but across, actually, as probably come across in this session, the victim profile, the landscape of different victims. I think the security forces did an incredible job. No agency across the world, no set of security forces across the Five Eyes, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, the traditional partners, could have dealt with this. At times, the security forces retreated to just trying to protect society because of what they were facing. They couldn't investigate these crimes properly at the time. The fact that they had so many prosecutions and convictions, frankly, was remarkable. But they would, I think, concede, and I've spoke to a number of senior investigating officers. I spoke to two very retired officers last night about a couple of issues I'm trying to help them with. They would say that where we got things wrong, and I think there's an emerging narrative here, we need to say we got it wrong. Today in policing, constantly, you'll be very alive to it in this building. We recognise the fact that we make mistakes, and where we make mistakes, there'll be independent examinations, there'll be public statements, there'll be apologies. If you imagine that's today in contemporary policing, magnify that by 100 as to what the security forces faced during the Troubles. And of course they made mistakes. And if we don't accept that on occasions things happen, such as being demonstrated in this report, I think it diminishes, it undermines the sacrifices and the hard work of everybody, because sometimes they were simply still doing their best, but they didn't have the structures and the guidance to help them. On other occasions, let's be very clear, people in the security forces did things that I would never, ever accept. And I joined policing in 1983. But it was rare. But where it happened, we do not hide it. We acknowledge it. We acknowledge it to the families. And we demonstrate that that could not happen again. And that's one of the things that we've tried to do through the Kenova report.
Thank you. And very finally, just in recent days, I've had reason to speak with the family of Harry Breen. Obviously, you will know of that murder. Harry and Bob were killed and the brutality of it. And just his family have spoken just about the lasting impact, both on Harry's wife and them as a family. I suppose when Smithick report was published, they felt there was some hope. There was a fanfare around it. There was significant spotlight on it. Really, it's gone nowhere, and nothing has happened with it. And I'm just keen to get your views on that and how we can continue to support both those families in that regard, and particularly around that collusion piece, where we go with that, and how we shine a spotlight on and really focus the Irish government on providing information.
So firstly, the murders of Mr Buchanan and Mr Breen are iconic cases. It feels to me, no life is more important than any other, but every time we start talking about cases, and Jim Shannon mentioned a couple of cases earlier, my heart goes out to every single family involved. Yeah, I read Judge Smithick's report. I met Judge Smithick. I think to a certain extent he had hoped that report might give some comfort to the families and the work that he'd done. I am very conscious that legacy, and I know we have the commission starts its work in May, only a few days away. The ideal position is that there would be a joint position on legacy with the Irish government, the British government, the Northern Ireland Executive. There would be an agreement with all the primary victims groups around such a framework. That's not where we are. It's where I wish we were. I've not given up hope on that. I support and will ensure that the PSNI cooperate absolutely with unfettered access to every bit of information, no redactions, all material that we hold that the Commission want from us. And I'm hoping that the Smithick report, the Kenova interim report, the Commission, it's a journey that hopefully we get to the right place very quickly, because people are of a certain vintage now, victims, and we've lost so many victims during Kenova that we've tried to give them the truth before we know that they're going to leave us and pass away. But if we don't get this right now, it'll be too late. It really will be too late. I know there's lots of concerns about the Commission. My view is it's the only thing that we have, and we should cooperate with Sir Declan. We certainly will. I will. The PSNI will. And in recent inquests that have stopped because of this sword of Damocles sort of timing of inquests having to finish at the end of April, any information where inquests haven't finished, we will give everything that we've got to the Commission. So I would hope families will go to the Commission and get that information through Sir Declan. But we're not where we need to be at the moment. I accept that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Claire Hannah, just quickly.
We're not where we need to be, and whatever is coming, and I don't mind admitting that I think there's more for Dublin to do as well, but the way to do that is an agreed process, and the concerns and the queries that certainly from my part and colleagues are forwarding, and the case that the Irish government's taken to Strasbourg, which I think is the right thing to do given the approach it is to move forward on these issues like disclosure, like we saw at Kingsmill last week, that the IRA wouldn't cooperate with that. The culture still exists of not cooperating, and that's why there's more to explore. I just want to come back to recommendations 9 and 10 on the apologies. As I say, I'm still old-fashioned enough to believe in prosecutions for psychopathic crime, but I think you're right to say that apologies really can be cathartic, and the recommendations were very good and were very strong. For what it's worth, I thought the Sinn Féin Vice President's remarks, I'm glad there was an acknowledgement, but I thought they were very inadequate, insufficient, and non-specific, but they were a lot better than what Gerry Adams said in an article just a couple of weeks before publication, where he casually referred to the fact that killing and secret burial of people has long been a brutal feature of war, and goes on to quote from a UN report documenting thousands of cases from 82 states, which sounds to me a lot like justifying the horrific crime of disappearance and explaining it away, rather than anything like acknowledging the hurt and apologising. And of course, recommendation 9 for the UK government, the Prime Minister declined to give an apology when my colleague Colin Eastwood MP asked him at PMQs last week, on the basis that this is an interim report. Will the final report make the same suggestion for an apology? And I suppose it's not for you to decide. And you've been very, very open and clear that you believe an apology is warranted from both the Republican movement and from the British government. Will that follow through in the final report?
Absolutely. I mean, a key part of the final report will be an update on the recommendations, the actions taken, or any further actions that we think are necessary. And again, as I said earlier, that's why I've had early engagement, relatively early engagement, I would say, with the Cabinet Office to continue to pursue the recommendations to ensure, from our perspective, that they're implemented, because, as John's alluded to today, they've been very carefully considered. And I think Judith made a number of incredibly important points, both today but to us privately, about steps that can be made to give life to these key recommendations. So absolutely, that will be a part of the final report, will be an update on action taken.
Thank you. Just to say thank you for the work. It is very important. They were some of the most brutal, and I think it's very clear they were carried out against literally the most vulnerable people, children, adults with learning difficulties, small children who had their mother taken from them. And really, I'm sure it was a very harrowing piece of work for you all to work on, and I think it was important, and people are very grateful for it. Thanks.
Thank you. Can I just end and go back to steak knife? Now, I know that the interim report has come to the conclusion that probably their continued operation probably resulted in more lives lost than being saved. Can I just explore the assertions, the findings that relate to the inherently implausible nature of the claims that were being made that more lives were being saved by them, and whether or not the security services would have known at the time that there were overblown claims being made, and whether or not there was any evidence you uncovered that they ever tried to challenge these claims.
So, with regards to the commentary about, if you like, the value of the agent steak knife, how many lives were actually saved. Having had the opportunity to look at the material with regards to his reporting, and being generous to a certain extent in the lives that we think he saved, or could be attributed to him being saved, they were nowhere near the hundreds that anecdotally have been mentioned by people in the media, people associated with the security forces who were not close to the agent steak knife. What I found in the journey I've been on with Kenova, and I talk about the media in here, and the media have a very important role to play in Northern Ireland. There's been some outstanding investigative journalism in Troubles-related cases. But there is an irresponsible nature in the media of reporting things that are factually not true. Judith mentioned earlier, it's really difficult for families to hear stuff and then find out it's not true. A lot of that happens in the media. A lot of it happens on social media. I've had families contacted by accounts that are pretty anonymous on social media saying, such and such killed your mother, such and such killed your father. And to have to go to them and show them that that's not accurate. But if there wasn't a Kenova, I don't know where those families go who get that information fed to them. They're left with this, I mean, it's extraordinarily vile, misinformation about what happened to their loved ones. With regards to the calculation of the value of steak knife, I understand why, but I think there's been a chorus of defensiveness in the security forces around steak knife and other elements of security forces' actions during the Troubles, whether it be Bloody Sunday, Ballymurphy, where there's been a narrative that when the layers are removed and the facts are examined, have proved to be entirely wrong. And I think it would benefit all of us to stop that propaganda and just be candid and transparent about what did happen in these cases. And certainly not to say things that are are not true or give misinformation. And that doesn't rewrite history. Carla's point and the wording she provided around my description of the IRA committed these murders. The IRA commissioned the Internal Security Unit. The IRA intimidated families in ways that have been described to me that, even with my background, have sort of reset my frame for what awful things one human being will do to another. The security forces, I think, since the Good Friday Agreement, we have taken a position of not accepting things that we got wrong, or not accepting an examination of things that we may have got wrong. And I think as a democracy, it's what sets us apart when we do that. And I pick on the point around the lack of an acknowledgement or specific apology from the Republican movement into the detail of these cases. You know, they could show a different face by actually doing that sort of apology. And I would certainly expect the British government, at least and hopefully at the time of the final report from Sir Iain, to give the sort of apology that I think people in the security forces and the British government know is probably owed to these families. But we're still going to obviously have to wait for that.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a long session, but quite rightly so, because so much ground to cover, so many difficult issues, so many twists and turns in this. And can I put on the record the committee's thanks to all of you and indeed to everybody involved in Kenova, for work that is thorough, that is vital, and that is an important part of a process by which we do not forget what happened, but understand it better and give either justice or explanation or information to all those who remain deeply affected by the consequences of this aspect of the Troubles. Order, order.
Proceeding has ended. The 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 proceeding has